Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan with another of our double shot interviews, and I'm joined by Mark Butcher, who is the Treasurer of the Auckland Council, the Super City. Thanks for coming in, Mark. Appreciate your time. Look, we're interested in talking about the funding and debt arrangements that the Council runs. You're now the biggest local government organisation in Australasia, so the scale of everything is pretty big, and obviously it's new, less than 2 years old. So look, you've got three main funding strategies that I understand. Domestic funding, you've also got the local government funding agency, and you've got an offshore program of up to $2.5 billion US. Can you just give us a quick rundown on those three? Starting off with your domestic program, you've obviously just announced a $125 million 6-year retail bond.
Yep, for sure. Look, I think you got to sort of put it in the context. A year ago, we were funding all domestically. So we didn't have the local government funding agency. We didn't have the ability to fund in foreign currency. So we've had a historical reliance upon domestic funding from both retail investors and also wholesale investors. But what we've realised over the past 2 years now is that we can't rely fully on those domestic investors. So
can you just not source enough money from them? Or?
Yeah, so we are the largest borrower in New Zealand after the central government, after the four major banks, and obviously shortly after the local government funding agency. So we really need to diversify our funding sources, lengthen the term of our debt as well too, and basically just diversify the investor base as we go through this large investment program in Auckland, which is debt funded. So we still want to rely upon domestic investors, but we're moving from a position, say, a year ago of being 100% funded by domestic investors to eventually, probably over time, being about a third funded by domestic, a third through the LGFA, and a third through offshore funding. So domestic funding important to us still. Cheapest borrowing cost in the world is to fund domestically or through the local government funding agency, but really important to diversify. So what we've done in terms of a domestic program is that we've now launched a retail bond program, and today was the first issuance under that out there, so that retail investors, ratepayers could actually participate on exactly the same terms as what wholesale investors can participate.
Can you give us an idea of how much of that money you raised went to retail investors, and how often we might see you come to the market with retail bond offers?
Yeah, okay, so going forward, everything we should be doing in the domestic market should be under the retail bond documentation. We really want to grow that. We want to have those debt issues listed on the NZX. Currently, we've got about 15,000 investors, of which 14,800 are retail. So the other 200 are banks, institutional investors and offshore. In today's issue, we had a larger than expected amount of retail coming through private banks, coming through share broking firms. We deliberately accepted all that interest. So we had about $270 million worth of bids for the $125 million bond issue. I can't remember the exact proportion that went to retail, but we took the strategic view that this is the first issue under the new program. We've got to show our intent that it is, whenever we can get retail investor involvement, we should actually take that. So it was a great outcome. It was better than what we expected. Interest rates are low. We have all this feedback that retail investors don't want to take something with a yield of 4.41% on it. So we were pleasantly surprised by it. So it was a positive outcome.
And obviously the local government funding agency has kicked into life this year. They are allowed to borrow offshore as well, so they can borrow money from offshore investors, as well as domestic ones, institutions. How does your relationship with the local government funding agency work in terms of how do you determine when you go to them to borrow money and how much you borrow through them, and indeed how much have you borrowed through them so far?
Yep. Okay. So we're a major player within the LGFA framework. We're a shareholder along with 30 other, 29 other council shareholders now. We are the largest borrower. We're currently about 40% of their total assets or total lending. And because we're out there borrowing in our own name, we're now one of the few councils too, we have to be well coordinated with it. So we will try and steer clear now away from the LGFA maturity dates. We'll also try and move away from when they're issuing as well too. So real cooperative stance, because clearly the LGFA is helping us in terms of us meeting our funding goals, which is really important, and so we do coordinate. So we've participated so far in 7 out of the 8 tenders from LGFA, and we'll continue to be a really active supporter of LGFA, not only to assist us but also to obviously assist the sector. In terms of volumes, I think we've done about $525 million of funding through the LGFA currently.
And your offshore borrowing program was put in place late last year. It's up to $2.5 billion US, and you have the ability to list debt on the Singapore Stock Exchange. How much have you borrowed through that program so far, and where's the interest coming from?
Okay, so we had the approval in place at the end of last year. We put together the program, did our first issuance in February. To date, we've raised about $200 million. Primarily from Japanese-based investors in Australian dollars for a 10-year term. So the Japanese life insurance companies like the credit story, like the yield, like the diversification to this end of the world. So we've had a really good response out of Japan. We've just recently been through Switzerland and getting a similar response from them as well too. Going forward, yes, we've got the MTN program established. As we need additional funding, as I said at the start, we would expect our new funding sources to be not domestic, but basically LGFA and offshore. So the offshore funding is going to become a critical part in us getting the volume in, getting the diversification of investor base, and also offshore investors tend to lend for longer time frames than what the domestic investors do. So to date we've borrowed 10-year term funding. We'd expect that to continue under our offshore program. So it's a great enhancement for us.
Now, I'm interested to know how your funding policies are determined. I mean, obviously, Auckland Council has a mayor and elected officials, but also the likes of yourself running a Treasury department. So who comes to you and tells you how much money they need, and how is it determined whether that, how you raise that money?
Yep. Okay. Good question. Yes. So local council finance 101. Under the Local Government Act, we have to act prudently and look after the assets of the region for the benefit of the region. So what that means is that we have to run a balanced budget to start with at the operating level. So it means that we will only borrow to fund new investment or renewals of existing. So we only fund to borrow CapEx. So what that means is that when the councillors under the long-term plan determine the amount of investment in the region, both new investment and renewals, that then dictates how much we have to borrow. And so once under the long-term plan the level of investment, level of borrowing is determined, then we are given the challenge, I suppose, of going out there and actually sort of borrowing it. So, of course, what happens to the politicians is that they then also have to back solve, because when you borrow, there's also an interest repayment, principal repayment obligation as part of that. Because you have to run a balanced budget, what that means is that to make an investment decision, you have to have a borrowing decision. You then have to have a repayment decision involved, which means rate increases as well too. So we're at the end of the process. So the long-term plan process takes, I think, up to about 8 months to do, 9 months to do. The annual plan process takes, I think, up to about 5 months to actually go through the process. We're at the end of that process in terms of this is the borrowing requirement. So it then gets delegated down to the Treasury team, who then look at it from a point of view of diversification, lengthening the term of borrowing, providing the cheapest cost of funds as well too. So that's kind of the decision process which we go through. Can
you tell us how much money the Auckland Council will borrow this year, and what the current debt levels are and where they're forecast to go over the next decade? Because I know you've got your long-term plan going out 10 years.
Yeah, so a big funding requirement. Currently we have debt at the group level, which includes water care, of close to $5 billion. Over the next 10 years, that increases to $12.5 billion at its peak. What you have to remember there, though, is that assets are going up from currently about $36 billion of assets. They increase over the 10 years to about $58 billion worth of assets. So debt increases by $7.5 billion, assets increase by $22.5 billion over that time. So therefore, equity from a ratepayer's point of view increases from about $29 to $42 billion. And that increase occurs because obviously we've got government contributions in terms of transport, CapEx, we've got inflation in terms of assets increasing in value, you've also got the private sector in terms of coming in as well too. So debt's increasing, but also assets are increasing. What it means for the funding requirement is we've also currently got that $5 billion debt portfolio that needs to be refinanced. So our total borrowing across the group is about $14 billion over the next 10 years. So across the group it's about $1.4 billion sort of borrowing requirement year in, year out, which is why we needed local government funding agency, why we needed the offshore borrowing program to be established. So big numbers, but you've got to remember the region is big. It's a third of population, of New Zealand's population. It's 37% of national GDP. Over the next 30 years, the population increases by 60% from 1.5 million to 2.4 million. As a percentage of national statistics, we get to over 40% of population, 40% of GDP. So if you don't do this investment, if you don't borrow, then not only is Auckland going to not go forward, the rest of the country's not going to go forward either.
But obviously, in these days, a lot of people are nervous when they hear such big numbers of debt, obviously, with what's happened in the world in recent years. So can you understand that nervousness? And also, you recently raised your net debt as a percentage of total revenue limit to 275% from 175%. So I guess, how do you respond to people who are a bit worried about this concept of their council borrowing so much money, even though obviously, as you point out, it is a very big entity? Yes,
I think you've got to remember, though, the credit rating agencies have looked at our debt projections. They've kept our credit rating unchanged at AA, AA2. The Auditor General, Audit New Zealand, have looked at it and sort of considered it to be prudent levels of debt. In a world of credit rating downgrades, every week you hear of further downgrades, then, for us to maintain our credit rating from independent sources would also suggest that they are looking at it and suggesting that we can actually, service that debt, refinance that debt as well too. But certainly large numbers, but as I said before, Auckland is such a large proportion of the country that, and there's been a underinvestment in infrastructure in Auckland in the past, and if we want Auckland to grow, then we've just got to do this. Understand the concerns, but when you look at what needs to be done, then it's probably justified, based on those factors.